Whenever hackers attack a Linux computer always keeps records. It always keeps logs. These logs, they are all over the Linux system. And in this challenge, you will learn about them. So this challenge is on TryHackMe. It's called Linux Logging for SOC, Security Analysts. So we'll analyze this Linux box and see if we can find those records. So I'm going to click check here. And one thing you have to know is that on Linux, all those logs are in text files. So those text files are all over the place, but typically in the var log folder. So you can check that with cd var log. That enters the var log folder. And if I then list the files with the ls command, you'll see we find a bunch of log files here. Now the first log file they're interested in is this syslog. We can take a look. So we could say output that syslog file and show only the top. And you'll see we see some commands for that the Linux system has logged. Now you can filter that information using the grep command. So if I say grep and for example I search for EC2, you will only see the lines that contain EC2. Now this appears to be a lot. So let's say only lines that contain the word disk. And you'll see quite a lot contain the word disk2. Anyway, with the grep command, you can filter the output of the text file. So they say here in the first question, use the var log syslog file to answer the question, which time server domain did the VM contact to sync its time? So there must have been some domain name, some website name. You'll see here, two dots and 3 letters at the end. Now we could try to search for time. So we could say grep and then search for time. And then we could scroll up in this list, see if we see something. Now this is quite a huge list. So maybe we'll need to filter it some more. So we could try searchingport.com. And you'll see here ntp.ubuntu.com. So that's probably the time server. If we check, you'll see it's correct. So from the external computer, they get the current time and they configure this Linux computer to be matching with the time of that computer. That's the time server. So we found the evidence of that here, ntp.ubuntu.com. See here, ntp.ubuntu.com. Okay, on to the next question. So there's a kernel message from Java in this syslog. So what we can do is filter this log and we'll search for Yama. And you'll see the message is becoming mindful. Becoming mindful dot. So with the cut command, you can output a whole file. And then if you add the pipe grep, you can search for something in the file. Now, of course, you can do this with a text editor, but it's much more fast to do that in the command line directly. So let's go to the next log file. These are authentication logs. Linux has a file, this out.log, which are authentication logs. And on Red Hat based systems, they have this other file, but you'll see this is Ubuntu based, so Debian based. This is not a Red Hat system. You'll see here Linux, and specifically this is Ubuntu Linux. This is not Red Hat Linux. Otherwise, you would have to look at this secure file. Anyway, we have this out.log, and they want to know which IP address failed to log in multiple users. So we can take a look at this out.log, and you'll see there's a lot of things here. In this file, we see some internet addresses here. For example, this address, 10.14. Now it could be that that's the address they're looking for, but let's filter them. They say via SSH. SSH is a protocol that allows you to log in on a Linux system and control it. So what we can do is try to filter for SSH. And you'll see we now filter SSH, and then I see here root from this address, Ubuntu from that address, invalid user from that address. So let's try that address. So that's 10.14.94.82. And it takes a second or so to load. So some users in the sudo group, they can run administrator commands. So any user would like to be in the sudo group because it means they can control the system. Now let's see, they ask us which users was created and added to the sudo group. So to find out, we could take a look at the file varlog out.log. So this varlog/out.log. And then we filter on sudo to see if we can find anything. So you'll see we have sudo here, session closed. We have some session closed, and then it says here add xedex to group sudo. So xedex must be a username, and xedex to shadow group sudo. So probably that is the username. And not quite sure how to spell that. Okay, there we go. Next we go on to common Linux logs. So these are not the only Linux logs. This syslog is common, it's system messages from the hardware, and this outlog from people messing around with your system. Could be they're trying to log in or trying to become administrator if they have already access to try to become the root user. So there's other messages. We have this current log from the Linux system itself if there's errors. Then we have this syslog or messages, so it's just Linux events. We have dpkg.log on Debian system. This is software packages that you install or remove. And for Red Hat based systems, they have this DNF log. That's a package manager for Red Hat Linux systems, like Fedora or similar systems. In this case, we're using Ubuntu. So on TryHackMe, they almost always use Ubuntu, which has Debian based. And that's why they have this dpkg.log. And they have some app specific logs. For example, if you run a web server, if your computer gives websites to people around the world, you have a web server and you have perhaps running the Nginx software to do that, or the Apache software. So those logs are stored there in varlog with the web server name. Okay, and then they show some general command files. So bash history, those are the commands you run on your computer. For example, if I do cat /bash history, you'll see all the commands I typed so far. And in this case, only these have been recorded. If we do history, we can see the same thing. So these are commands we typed or I typed so far in this video. So with history and bash history, Linux keeps a record of the commands you type as a user. So let's see, they say something was installed on the server in the package manager logs and which version of unzip was installed on the system. So this is a Debian based system. That's why we have this file dpkg.log. If we list the files and folders, you'll see we have this file dpkg.log. So we can list this file and probably there's going to be a lot of stuff inside it. So you'll see all the things that have been installed and removed and so on. Now they specifically ask not for the entire file, but for a program called unzip. So we simply do grep and we filter on unzip. And that tells us version 6.0-28 was installed and all this stuff after. And let's see if we can quickly copy that. Or if yes, there we go. So that version was installed. And then they say, what is the flag you see in one of the user's bash history? So one thing to keep in mind with this history file, this .bash history, is that every user has one. So the administrator, the root user has one, the Ubuntu user has one, and any other user has their own history, has their own history file. So let's go to the home folder and see which users we have there. We always see Ubuntu. Now we can enter Ubuntu. And if I list the hidden files with this, you'll see that file .bash history. Now let's take a look if there is any flag in there. And notice that it starts with a dot. It's a hidden file. So let me run this command. And in here, we don't see any flag. So it could be that the root user has that flag. So let's see if we can become the administrator, the root user, with the command sudo su. And you'll see we instantly became root. There's no password protection on this system. So let's go to the folder /root, which is the folder for the root user. So that's /root. Then list the files and folders, and we have this file .bash_history. Let's take a look. Inside the file, inside the history of the user root. And you'll see we found the flag here. So let's copy that and paste it in. Okay, seems something went wrong with this pasting. There we go. Now let's go to the next part. So they talk about runtime monitoring. All kind of things happen on the Linux system. In the logs, they are things that already happened, but things are happening right now. That is runtime. So they have some image here where they show monitoring. This is when you add the web logs and bash history, you can find more information. And if you also check with runtime events, you can find even more threads or things going on in the system. So this only checks the basic, right? This outlog. Did some user get added? Did they log in? And so on. Bash history, you can see more specifically what they did, like which commands did they run on the Linux system. And in web logs, you'll see which pages did they open. And with the runtime events, you can find even more. So you can find the most threads, of course, looking here. Here you can only find if somebody logged in. So on any Linux or on any computer system, what they do is system calls. So any software, any app on the computer, it doesn't have direct hardware access. It cannot say, okay, take this from the memory, take that from the disk. Everything has to go through the computer system, whether that's Windows, Mac, or Linux. Now in this case, of course, everything is Linux. So they ask things from the hardware, but not directly. They ask it through the system. So they ask the system, hey, can I read this disk? And the system says either yes or no. Otherwise, if the programs can bypass the system, they could directly read all the passwords from your computer, all the files and everything else, and all security would be gone. So that's why things go through syscalls. And on Linux, there's over 300 system calls. So if we click this link, you'll see a manual page on syscall, and they have all kind of system calls here. So access something, you'll see own a file, chown, do something with the clock. So everything has to, if a program wants to do something, they have to ask the Linux system through syscalls. They cannot access the hardware directly. Everything has to go through these syscall commands. So you'll see here a question, can a typical program open a file or create a program bypassing system calls? So that would mean the program is just gonna ignore Windows is there or Linux is there and go directly to the disk and grab whatever it wants. Now, of course, it cannot do that. It has to use those system calls. So this question is gonna be nay. Then they say, which Linux system is commonly used to execute a program? So you see here highlighted execve. So this system call is used to execute a program. So execve, you'll see that's also in here. So if you want to execute a program, you'll see here this execve, and it executes a program. So it lets your app execute a program. Okay, so there's all kind of system calls, and we don't have to go too much in specifics in this room, just to know that they exist. So next, there's another mechanism. That's the Auditd, or the audit daemon. So this is a bit more sophisticated tool on Linux to find out what is going on your system. So they have a log file here in audit.log. So we can actually output that. And this Auditd sometimes have to be manually installed. It might not always be available on my Linux system. So you'll see there's lots of stuff in there, and it's impossible to read all this data. So what you can do is you can use tools that come with this Auditd system, like the AU search. So you can search, for example, take that example, for that wget program, the process wget, and you'll see it gets filtered out. It's still a bit hard to read, right? But it's at least it fits in the screen instead of being endless. So you can search for different things. For example, here they search for something else. There are some alternative systems, and they are. Now, sometimes with TryHackMe, you have to be careful with how they word things. So in this case, they're looking for file_thm secret. So you'll see access to the file is locked with that key. But let's search for that. So we type in here file_thm secret, and you'll see we find it several times. But again, we have this Unix timestamp in this audit log, right? It's not very readable. So let's try to find it with AU search. So we say AU search -a -k, and then file underscore THM secret. And you'll see it took a moment, but it did find it. So it says here cat/secret THM, and we have some timestamp here. So let's try that. We have this 08/13/25. And then the time, which seems to be around this 18:36:54. And you'll see it got that correct. Now they have the next question where what is the original file name downloaded from GitHub via wget. So with the wget command, you can download something from the internet. We'll see if I press wget enter. They want a URL, they want a link to download something directly to the Linux computer. So in this case, they locked it with this key, proc_wget. So we type AU search -a -k proc wget. And you'll see we have a bunch of things, and they say downloaded from GitHub. So GitHub is a popular website where programmers store data, where they store their apps. So you'll see if I move this up here, you'll see at the bottom here github.com and blah, 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 and they save it as this nabu.zip. Anyway, they want to know which original file name downloaded. So the original file name, that is this file name. You'll see here github.com/blah, blah, 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 / and then the file name. So this is the file name that they're looking for. Let's see, copy this, yes. Next, let's go to the next challenge. They say which network range was scanned using the download tool. So apparently there was this download tool, maybe that Nabu is a download tool. Let's take a quick look again. I have no idea about this Nabu. It seems to be some kind of a web, some kind of a project. We could take a search for that. Maybe that is what they want. So no matches for Nabu. Now let's see the hint. So it said you might want to use grep, look for keywords like the tool name. So we could, let's try with the Auditd log instead. See if we can find something about that Nabu. So we output the Auditd log, and then we filter for that word Nabu, which was software they downloaded. And then they say which network range. So that's like sets of internet addresses, right? Like if IP address is a house address, then a network range is like a neighborhood. So we see some numbers here, right? 192.168.50.0/24. So that is the network range. So if we copy that and then paste it in, you'll see we have that challenge completed as well. Then we are in the final question, in the conclusion, and all we have to do is click check, or if you want, you can read all the stuff. And that's it for this challenge.